Hello everyone. Today we'll be looking at a game from the recent Isle of Man tournament. This is Magnus Carlsen versus Maxim Matlakov. Magnus Carlsen, the current world champion, and Maxim Matlakov, a very strong grandmaster from Russia. We would be directly going to this position. So the thing of interest is the position that we have right now. White has a queen and black has just a rook and a pawn. But the interesting thing here is, if you see, the pawn is going this way, so this pawn is on c6. So the rook covers the entire d file and the entire fifth rank, right? So if you draw a square, right, starting from here all the way here, so this whole area, the rook is cutting off both the queen as well as the king, right? Especially the king, right? So by cutting off the white king, not letting through inside the square, black, this is the weakest point for black, the c6 pawn. Black is fending off any threats to the c6 pawn. So that's the nature of the position. So black's plan is going to be very simple: keep all the three pieces together, because the moment you keep them far away, then there is always a risk that one of them may be lost. The queen may check and lose a piece. So keep the pieces together and just keep moving your rook on the fifth rank. Let's say rook b5, rook d5, rook a5, something close to the king. So this is a kind of a fortress that black has created. So the question is, can we break this fortress? So Carlsen is famous for what he said, that he doesn't believe in fortresses. So let's go through the game. But prior to going through the game, I want to explain to you the method that is involved here in terms of how we break this fortress. All right. There are three main stages in terms of how white should try to penetrate the fortress here. So again, let's go to the basics. The weakest point in this position is the pawn on c6. Black is able to defend this position because the king is not able to come through. The king is not able to go beyond the fifth rank because the rook is well supported by the pawn, right? And there's no way to attack this particular pawn. So there are three stages in which we will conduct this game. So the number one, we need to get the most obvious plan is, of course, find a way to get the king behind this pawn, let's say on c7 or d7 or b6, in a manner where the king can combine along with the queen to attack this pawn, and there won't be a way for black to defend this pawn. So that's the plan. Now, how do we achieve it, right? So if you pay a little attention, right, so there are two barriers here. The first barrier is if you have to penetrate the square. If you look at this as a square, right, if you have to penetrate the square, first barrier is the fifth rank, and the second barrier is the d file, right? So we have to penetrate these two barriers, right? And then get the queen behind the pawn. Let's say, for example, get the queen to a square like b8 or c8. So the black king is driven, doesn't have squares here, so it has to come in front of the pawn, right? And let's say we get our king here to e4 or f4, right? So that is the first stage, where we want to control as many squares behind this pawn with our queen, right? And then once that happens, the king has to stay close to the rook, right? So the rook is going to lose some mobility, because when the king comes here, because the queen is behind the pawn and controls a lot of these squares, the rook will lose mobility. It may not be able to move a lot on these squares without being risked being lost with some checks. So, and when the rook moves this way, the king is going to cross over this way, right? And in the same manner, right, we are going to force the black king and rook to come either on the c file or on the d file, and then the king is going to cross over into the d file. So that's the method. So we'll demonstrate that, and I'm going to use the game the way Carlsen played to see how the game proceeded from here. Yeah. So in this position, Carlsen played queen f7 check. It's consistent with the plan. He's slowly gaining more and more squares on in this area. So black plays king b8, king g3. He's improving the king position. black plays rook check. I mean, black's plan is simple. He's just going to keep the rook on this rank without losing it in a safe position, right? So rook g5 check, king f4, all logical moves. So rook goes back to d5. Now, so we need to proceed further. So we need to control more squares here. So Carlsen goes queen f8 check, king b7, queen b4 check, king c7. So if you can see, Matlakov is not allowing Carlsen's queen to b8, where it will be ideal. So he's doing his best to stop it, right? So king e4, he's improving the king further and forcing black to make a move now. Yeah, king c8. So now, because the king has moved away, queen b6. I'm attacking this pawn. There's only one way to defend that. King d7, queen b7. So if you see, slowly but surely Carlsen is taking control of this position. Yeah, and now he plays queen c8, right? So again, so if you see, he's totally controlling all these squares, d7, c7, b7, and when the king moves here, let's say king goes to c5, which I think is forced right now, because if the pawn moves, then he's gonna lose the rook with a check here. The king moves, then he's gonna lose the pawn, and if the rook moves, it's always dangerous. So king moves here, and then eventually he'll have to bring the king here, right? So he plays king c5 and queen b8. So we have achieved our first goal, right, where we wanted to get the queen behind the pawn, drive the black king away, and control as many squares as possible here. That is exactly what we have achieved. Now, what does this achieve for us, right? So having done this, right, the queen on b8 is the most ideal spot because it controls all these squares and it controls all these squares, right? So it really restricts the activity, the squares that are available for the king. Now, if the king moves further, right, so let's say if the pawn can't move, if the black king moves, there's only one square, king c4. If he goes to c4, then I'll play queen b6, right? And then this pawn is in danger now, right? So, and if you play c5, then queen e6 loses the rook. With this, Matlakov now chooses to move his rook, right? So he, because the king can't move without giving up the b6 square, the rook can actually move in this file. So it's a little dangerous. He has to be very precise. So he plays rook h5. So fortunately, there are no checks where the rook is being lost. The goal here is, if you see here, the rook has these squares d5, e5, f5, g5, and h5, right? If he chooses to go on the d file, the king is going to cross over, right? So he has to keep moving in one of these 5 squares. So all Carlsen is doing is he's going to bring the king to g4, so it controls all these 3 squares, and the queen is controlling the e5 square, and create a zugzwang, right, where black has to move his rook away from the 5th rank, right, and then the king is going to cross over. So that is exactly what Carlsen's plan is. So he played king f4, rook d5, king g4. So we discussed this position. So now you don't have squares on the 5th rank for the rook, right? h5, g5, f5 is covered, e5 is covered, the queen is ideally placed here. So the king has to move. So he plays king c4. See, we achieved our first goal. So now we are going to attack the pawn with queen b6, right? So now what can black do here, right? If you play c5, it's very dangerous, because I can always play queen e6. You have to come king d4, right? And my king already, and now I can queen e6, king d4, and I can just make a simple move like king f4, because rook h5, then you may lose the rook with queen check and queen check, and the rook has to move back, and then I'll penetrate, right? So the other possibility is something like rook c5, but it's not sustainable because everything is jammed, right? And when king has to come to d5 at some point, to stay close, my king is going to cross over. So Matlakov plays rook d4 check. So he recognizes that there is no way to stop this king from going across. So now we have achieved the second goal, right? The first goal was to get the queen behind the pawn. The second goal was to force the rook to move away from the fifth rank, because the king is blocking its own mobility of the rook. And now we move forward. So we achieved the second goal, which is crossing the fifth rank. Now we're going to see how we're going to get the king to cross this d-file barrier, right? This barrier, right? So that's the next thing we'll do. Now black plays c5. He needs to keep all his units close together. So white, now the same idea. So just like the way we controlled squares on the b file and in this diagonal for the king, we're going to again restrict the king, right? So ideally we want to bring the queen to this side, let's say c2 or c1, right? And then when the king crosses over, right, to d5, you go behind, right? King f6, king e7, and go behind where there is no way for the rook to block, because the king is actually blocking its own rook, right? So that's the typical plan. So Carlsen plays queen a5, rook d5 check, king e6, very consistent in his plan, rook d4, queen a5, king c3, queen a3 check, king c4. So what do we do now, right? So Carlsen is not hurrying, he's just taking his time, he's improving the position. I mean, he could have directly played queen b2, but he's just taking his time, he's not in any hurry. Queen a5, rook d3, queen a4 check, king c3. Please don't worry about the exact moves, there could be a slightly different sequence of moves as well, but look at the overall plan, right? How he slowly gets his queen to the second or the first rank on the c file, and then the king goes behind the pawn. All right, queen a3, king c4, black has to stay together, queen c1, right? So he slowly maneuvered his queen and he's got the queen to the first rank. Now if black plays rook c3, I'm just going to give queen f4 check, and then because the rook has moved away here, I'll just give a check and then move the king to d6. So I've crossed the d file, right? So that's a problem. So black plays king b4, so queen b2 check. Again the same problem. If you block with the rook, I'm just going to play something like queen d2 check and then cross over, right? So king c4, queen c2 check. Now black doesn't have a choice, either he plays king d4 or he has to play rook c3, right? So if you play rook c3, I just play queen e4 check and then king d6. So black plays king d4, but I've achieved the same goal. The rook still remains on the d file, but the king has blocked the rook. Because the king has blocked the rook, now the king can go behind the pawn, king d6. So we have achieved the third goal, we have crossed the d file as well, right? And now we can attack this pawn with both the queen as well as the king, right? So we have achieved this goal. So black shouldn't be able to survive for long here, right? c4, queen f2 check. Basically my king has to come to c5 to attack this pawn, so he's just creating a square for the king, rook e3. Black is trying hard to avoid that, not allowing the square. So queen d2 check, and here black resigned. So why did black resign here, right? If rook goes to d3, I just give queen f4 check, king c3, king c5, and this pawn is lost, right? If the king goes to e4, right, king goes to e4, I can just play queen d5 check and queen takes pawn. So there is no way to defend the pawn. I hope that was useful. Thank you very much.